This is Identity at the Center.
If it has anything to do with IAM, this is the go-to podcast. Now your hosts, Jim McDonald and Jeff Stedman.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
I'm doing great, man. We're here doing another sponsored spotlight episode, and these are fantastic. And I'm really excited with the one that we got today. I mean, you know, I think we kind of hit the jackpot in terms of what we're going to talk about today is a company called Veza. I don't want to steal the thunder of the show, but I guess if you saw the title of the podcast, you know already we're talking to Rich from Veza. But it's like this up and coming company, right? And it's like it can't be ignored for sure. And to me, it's just like, wow, like we're going to talk about so many great things today.
Yeah. So I guess you've already spoiled it. We're talking with Veza. I know. But want to make it clear, right? This is a sponsored episode. We actually work with our sponsors on these and kind of come up collaboratively of how we want to develop a show that we think will be entertaining, informative, but also get us, deeper into specific viewpoints, specific solutions, something that we try to stay away from on our normal shows. But this gives us an opportunity to talk with, really smart people and really ask specific questions that are maybe more product focused than we normally would, where we're really talking big ideas, maybe stuff like that. Yeah. Not that we want to talk big ideas here, but gives us a little more specificity. We can kind of talk through things.
Yeah, I didn't want to give away the identity. What I really wanted to say was we got the man with the golden pipes back on the show. Excited to hear him talk because like he has like a Grover Washington type voice.
Yeah, definitely good pipes. So today's sponsor is Veza. They're the identity security company. They think that they've cracked the code on cybersecurity's hardest question. Who can take what action on what data? ? Let's find out more with our guest. His name is Rich Danliker. He's the chief strategist at Veza. Welcome back to the show, Rich.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Jim. It's great to be here. And now I was just all the time when you were talking and on my intro, I was hoping my voice wouldn't crack right out of the gate here.
Well, see, that's the thing is I do the editing, so I can insert little imperfections if I needed to, but I'm not going to do that because I'm absolutely jealous. You've got great radio pipes, as they like to say in the biz, right?
Thank you. As long again as you don't tell me I have a face for radio, then I'm good.
No, Jim and I have that covered for sure. We have faces for radio and voices for a silent movie, is what I like to say. Rich, you've been with us before. You were with us in episode 231 back in September of 2023. We had a conversation about authorization. We also found out really about your kind of background there. So tradition we would ask that question, but we've already asked you that. How did you get into the identity? You want to hear that story? Go back to episode 231. Why don't we get right into Veza itself? Jim mentioned sort of, where you guys are kind of coming up and really, making a lot of impact on the market. Making a lot of noise. What specifically is driving the momentum around Veza, and how does that success reflect your unique values?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And by the way, it is great to be back on the show. I really did enjoy the last time, and so it's nice to be here again. But around with Veza, I think one of the things that really is striking to me as I sort of look, trying to be with an outside eye and look at us, is that I think it really does come down to customers. I think that's certainly my gauge for a great company is like who's actually buying, who's actually using, who's getting successful and getting value from the products. And I think that's been one where I've been really, really proud of what we've been able to do here. Just some really great companies and some really passionate champions. And so that's definitely part of, I think, what also makes people out in the market, makes CISOs, listen to other CISOs. Like that is typically how things sort of get bought, how things spread. And I think we have been doing a really nice job there. The second big thing I think is really that it's a pretty innovative idea and a concept. And I think I always try and make sure I'm not selling myself too much here, but I really think, I've been in identity for a while, and I think you guys have certainly been in identity for a while. And one of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of the players are they're kind of the same players you would have seen and expected, 15 years ago. And I think, the Okta sort of came in, but that was back in 2009 that Okta started. And so I think the identity hasn't had a tremendous amount of innovation over the last decade and a half. And I think it's been ripe, it's been ready. And so I think actually coming in with, I think, what is a pretty different approach in really trying to go deep into authorization, into this question of who can and should take what action on what data, I think has, I think people respond to that, and people have been hungry because, and I think everybody knows that identity is a big thing that needs to be really addressed.
So for people who aren't familiar with Veza, I guess let's set the table for folks. We've mentioned authorization, we've mentioned the question and the answer, right? Who can take what action on what data? What is Veza's sweet spot? What do you guys do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think from a value proposition, I think fundamentally the most important thing that we do is we help customers get to the reality of least privilege, right? If I think about like what like from a security perspective, like what's important, that I think is absolutely critical. Sometimes it's through governance processes like access reviews. Sometimes it's by having a tool that a security engineering person can go and actually look and find the biggest violations of least privilege to go and fix them. But I think fundamentally it's that preparation for the next breach, because it's just that always resonates with me when I hear people talk about, hey, it's not a question of if, it's a matter of when the next attack happens, the next breach happens. And I think really getting your organization ready, tightening down privilege, tightening around access, especially privileged accounts, that's like so critical. So fundamentally, like that's how I think about the value that we provide.
I mean, it's a very competitive market. You've got a lot of incumbents in this space. You've got upstarts. And I guess, how do you separate yourself from others in this place? What's the core factor or thing that makes Veza really stand out in your mind?
Yeah, I think that it really is starting at the data model. Like when I think about the product and I think about the platform that we've built around identity security, it's pulling together all this information about what we call is the reality of authorization. So it's pulling in user information, group information, role information, decomposing all that morass of AWS IAM and Azure RBAC, but then also going deep into the service level to pull out granular system level objects in all those services and things like local users, ACL level permissions. So really going and putting together a pretty unique data set into a graph, and not just mapping those entities, but the relationships between those identities. And I think that fundamental data model is, I mean, it's a beast, as you can imagine. Like that is really a tough problem to solve. But then once you have that, the things that you can then start applying that to around actually creating products based on that data model are really, really interesting. And you can do things that are sort of traditional, like IGA types of things, like provisioning and lifecycle management. You can do it in very different ways. And that's one of the things I'm a product guy at heart. And so that kind of stuff gets me excited when you can sort of go and attack those things that have been around forever, but do it in a dramatically different way that provides and solves problems that have been around forever.
Yeah, Rich, I mean, that really resonates with me. Anytime you hear of a new vendor, you try to, in your mind, compartmentalize, okay, where do I fit them, right? And I think the area that Veza's in the closest to is governance. But I feel like it's kind of like a gloss over just to say governance, right? It's like it's so much more than that, right? It's being able to drill down more than I've seen really anywhere else. But in talking to you about kind of the strategy of Veza in terms of the roadmap, I came up with the term the anti-convergence strategy, right? And there's a lot of IAM players out there today who are really in the strategy around convergence, right? Whether you like it or not, that's the route they're going, which is to bolt on additional IAM capabilities so that customers can kind of go one place to get everything. Your strategy is a lot different, right? Which is to kind of take this piece of the marketplace and really like provide a solution with differentiation, right? Am I right in that? Am I wrong in that? And then can you elaborate on it?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right in that, Jim, because one of the things that I notice also, it plays into this whole tension and sort of, difference in the market when you look at sort of the, big legacy companies versus startups. And certainly the approach of a big legacy company, and pick Microsoft, pick SailPoint, pick CyberArk, or whoever you want sort of in identity. And the general strategy is there, I need more stuff in my bag to sell, right? You go out and you want to say like, hey, I know people spend money on this and here are some budgets and I'm going to go use the connection to the customer to go sell more stuff and get a bigger share of wallet. And so it's all about, creating that portfolio. Whereas typically startups, that's where frankly most of the innovation starts. And that's one of the challenges here is like when I joined the company, I was like, man, I hope there's a market, but I don't know there's a market because it is so different. And that I think it is true. It's not like we could go and say, hey, we know a bunch of people spend money on this kind of solution because there was no type of solution like this before. And so I think it is, really deep diving on authorization and answering this question it's a bit riskier because there's not an obvious market. That this is sort of functionality that cuts across access management and the players like Okta, it cuts across PAM and the CyberArks of the world, it cuts across IGA, as you pointed out, and governance, cuts across SSPM, SaaS security posture management and data access governance with Varonis and all these different things. Authorization is something that's been sprinkled across all these different security markets. And no one has really before taken a comprehensive approach and say, I'm going to solve that problem. And I'm going to go deep in that. And I think that's what really makes Veza different.
Yeah, I think it makes sense for the company's strategies where they're in one spot, like access management, and to move into privilege or move into identity for exactly the reason you talked about, which is how do they take those existing relationships and build their company, right? But I think what you guys have done is built a better mousetrap, but it seems like your strategy is to build an even better mousetrap, right? But it does seem like that mousetrap can be leveraged in certain areas, right? Because I think a lot of what you're talking about today, what we're talking about currently, is taking access that exists and being able to analyze it. Well, what if you could provision only the access that a person needs? What are your thoughts there?
Well, you got a good crystal ball there, Jim, because that's exactly actually what we've been moving in, and so we've thought about this in sort of a 3-stage approach from a strategy, and we've started with the first stage is kind of visibility. It's like, hey, we just need to really understand what the reality is, so we can show people, and people could start using that data. And then we moved on to, okay, now how do we do remediation? That's step 2. And so now I can see, but now how do I fix? How do I see what's wrong? How do I see where the biggest risk, most highly damaging, potentially damaging instances of overprivilege exist so I can go fix them? But then you go on to stage 3, which is absolutely, as you point out, it's around control. It's around provisioning. How do I make sure I actually create the right level of permission out of the gate? How do I actually create those accounts either on birthright events, on joiner, mover, leaver types of things, or when someone is asking for access because they need additional access to do their job? That's where the magic happens. And then making a virtuous cycle. Right now, when you think about all the, this grand access lifecycle, when, for instance, you're in access reviews and you're saying, hey, somebody has access they shouldn't have, we should take that away. Well, how did they get that in the first place? Right? Because that had to get provisioned. Somebody either, fulfilled a ticket or there's a birthright policy that's wrong. And, just because you found one instance of it, is that the only instance of it? Is it where there's smoke, there's fire? Is this, something that's relevant for the whole group? Is there a whole role that's over permissioned? Or, there's something broken? And sort of how do you take those little instances that you find, and rather than just fixing those at a little granular level, how do you sort of take it and actually build intelligence into that to sort of fix the overall root cause of those processes that are broken?
So I want to take the conversation a little away from theoretical and more into the real world. I was poking around the Veza website, veza.com. There you go. There's a plug. You've got some really impressive logos that are kind of scrolling through there. And it makes me kind of wonder, beyond the logos that we've got there, what are there any indications of? Are there specific types of challenges that Veza is best suited to solve? What is that actual sweet spot that we've got here?
Yeah, you'll find there's a range of them, right? And so it's funny how every company is struggling with something that's often a little bit different. So in some cases, it's around sort of struggling with identities, right? And so it's not just human identities, but often one good example here is machine identities and service accounts, right? They might be trying to, sort of broaden the definition around governance to include things like that. It might be instances where they're actually seeing that typical role-based access control doesn't work for them, right? That they're trying to manage by groups and roles. And, and this is the canonical classic example is you've got a role that's named read only. And guess what? There are write privileges embedded in there. And so, and what you start to realize is that you're not really doing role-based access control. You're managing by names of roles and descriptions of roles, right? And so the reality is that, hey, what does this role actually do? Does being a member of this role and being able to assume this role actually allow this person to go blow away my customer database, as an example? And you say, well, I wouldn't want that, and I hope it doesn't, but I don't know. And so this is one of the things that when you start to pull on that thread, it becomes obvious that a new solution is required. And sort of like the way that different customers pull on that thread can vary. Sometimes it's an auditor that sort of figures it out and starts asking lots of uncomfortable questions. Sometimes it's the CISO themselves. And, it's like following up out of a breach where, it's only in asking these really concrete questions and understanding how limited all the existing tool sets are that a CISO or somebody or some executive of the company realizes that there needs to be a different way.
So I was going to ask a follow-up question here around, these are relatively large companies, right? Well known. I have to imagine that they already have tools in this space for identity and access management, probably a number of them, which leads me to the question of how do you get somebody who has already got tools in the space to say, oh, hey, you've got this new tool. It's called Veza. We should take a look at it and then actually get into some of these organizations. I mean, how do you establish that trust, that confidence, right? To say, hey, this is something that we've not been able to achieve with the tool sets that we have, and Veza is solving for us this specific thing or these specific things. Maybe there's a variety of them. How do you even get into that conversation with the CISOs, with the other folks who are making those decisions on their investments?
Yeah, well, the nice thing is that most CISOs are interested in new technologies. So so even if they're saying, hey, maybe I'm not going to buy anything, but they want to know what's going on, and so that's always something where you can, especially if it's something new and something that they haven't seen a lot of tools around. It's they generally are interested. And then it's sort of a question of like, hey, how does this map into something that's on my key priorities for the next year, right? So, when you actually get down to, okay, like, are they going to actually buy the product or not? It has to obviously be relevant for something that they care about. And that's one where, it can, again, it varies, right? And I know one of our customers, we were in the first meeting and actually we're having the conversation. It was sort of, we're dancing around it. And it was kind of interesting, but we saw something written up behind him on his whiteboard. And it was just the word China. And we said, China, what's that? And he started describing some of the problems that he was having with managing access to box folders. And so it was both the problem of having data from, because they had operations internationally. And so it was both from the example of data from people in China, so PII of Chinese nationals being accessed by people outside of China, and the reverse, that there were some sensitive things that if you were a Chinese national, you shouldn't get access to, and just being able to manage that, right? Of like this cross-border issue with a particular place where they had a lot of data that was important to them, and so it was and so that turned out to be a key use case for them, and so again. When you talk to all these different customers, it can vary. Sometimes it's GitHub, sometimes it's Salesforce, sometimes it's Snowflake, sometimes it's AWS, Azure, GCP, sometimes it's custom applications. And this is one where that was true for our very first customer, and they were trying to do it because they had built on top of their SaaS platform a help desk application, right? So custom app, but for all the people who were helping their customers resolve tickets, right, and resolve issues. And help desk folks are, there are a lot of them. They have a fairly high turnover. They're not always the highest paid and highest level. You've got a lot of analyst level people, and this CISO wasn't sure what the help desk people had access to when they were able to actually get into a customer tenant and get a pretty deep access. That was the number one thing that they were concerned about. So it really varies from customer to customer, sort of, what the area is that's most important. But so much of it revolves around that core theme that we've been talking about: who has access to what, and should they have that access?
So, Rich, you've been doing a lot of videos lately, and I saw a video on LinkedIn with you and your founder and CEO, Tarun Thakur. So, hi, Tarun. And he said something, I'm going to quote him here. Knowing who can take action on what data is the biggest identity challenge. So I wanted to break that down a little bit because I think when we talk identity, it's not always brought back to the data. You're protecting the data and knowing who has access to what data as being important. So why use the term data? Why is that the important differentiator?
Yeah, for us, it really comes down to the overall priorities of an organization. And when you think about, everybody talks in security about the crown jewels, the most frequent thing there is the data are the crown jewels. Like, why are you protecting it? It's not really because you need to protect the servers. It's not because the infrastructure is that valuable, because it's all dynamic, right? It's all in the cloud. Like, I don't really care that my infrastructure is protected, except that I need to protect the data that's running on that infrastructure, right? That tends to be the number one thing. And obviously there are exceptions to that. But when you go and have the board level conversation, when you're talking to the CISO, that has been a strongly resonant theme, is that I want to protect my data. Why are we doing all this? Why am I doing security at all? And that's been the piece that comes out is most strongly and something that that gets board level attention. That everybody knows if you have a breach around the data, that that makes the paper, right? That's the thing that really gets nailed. So it's really around that resonance of being able to connect it to a real business goal that everybody understands.
Yeah, and I know your role. You're not the front line, like cold calling people, where you might run into this objection, which is, "Oh, we do RBAC, so we don't need this," right? I mean, this kind of discussion really goes to, okay, level beyond RBAC towards a more data centric approach, right? Do you see that as people think RBAC is at the right level of managing security?
I think most everybody does RBAC, but when you point out some of these natural flaws, and I think one of my favorites to talk about this with is with reference to access reviews, because everybody's sort of gone through it. If you're a manager, you at any company of size, you've done an access review, and so you've gone through and done all these things where you said, "Hey, this is here's Fred, he's on my team, and here's all the stuff that Fred has access to, and is that right?" And I asked this question again. I remember back to one of the CISOs at one of my organization. I said, "Hey, what's your experience with that? Like, how is that a good experience for you?" And he said, "Yeah, half the time I don't know what I'm clicking yes to." And I was like, that's an extremely common experience. Is that people are saying yes, but it's kind of meaningless. It's this whole idea of compliance theater or security theater, right? People are going through the motions because you have to, right? You've got to have access reviews. You've got to check that box. But wouldn't it be great if you could actually do that and do that compliance process, spend the time, ask everybody who's managing to spend the time, and actually improve your security posture at the same time? Wouldn't that be great? Is that too much to ask? And we don't think it is. That you can actually do these all, that's the real reason you're doing access reviews, is you want to restrict access. You want to make sure that only the people who need it are getting access. And if you don't give people the right information about what that really means, you're asking them to do an impossible job. And this is the thing that I think is so fundamentally broken with most of these processes, is people are doing these things that they know don't really help. And there's a better way.
Let's talk about the principle of least privilege, because I kind of feel like least privilege and RBAC pull at opposite ends of the string. You've got RBAC where it's saying we need to establish these roles is going to give certain levels of application level access. But when you're talking about an enterprise, I mean, think of how many systems and how many roles within those systems that you have to manage amongst potentially hundreds of thousands of your workforce. Now, if you were to do true least privilege to every one of those systems and to the data, doesn't it become unmanageable?
Absolutely. Right. So the way I would look at it is, I don't know if I'd say they're at polar opposite ends of the spectrum, but I think the least privilege, everybody agrees with in principle. Like, I've never heard anybody say, nah, I don't believe in least privilege. Like, it's everybody agrees it's the right idea. It's really a question of how do you implement it. And so RBAC is the way I see is like most every organization at some level implements RBAC as a practical way to get to least privilege. But even within that, the challenge is, how do I get the right roles? How do I even assign the right roles? And so I'll give another example here. One of our customers actually uses Veza as a provisioning intelligence tool. What I mean by that is, what they have is they have a process around Snowflake. And so when a developer who's doing their developer job needs access to something in Snowflake, maybe a table in Snowflake, and they submit a ticket, and they ask, hey, I want to get the access to this. So the challenge this organization had before Veza was they had all these roles in Snowflake, and they didn't know which role to provision. Because that's the question, is like, how do you know what role best conforms to least privilege? The role that gives them access to that table that they need and as little else as possible. That's an incredibly hard thing to answer, right? Because there's no tool to actually see, what does this role do in Snowflake? Really, what does this give access to? And so by using Veza, they actually were able to implement that. So simply saying, hey, now I know what role to give, right? And by doing that, they actually measured this. So they had an internal process where they were actually looking at the total exposure and the total risk from all the different permissions on Snowflake. When they introduced Veza, after a year of doing this process, they were able to reduce the total number of permissions, the total risk on Snowflake, by 80%. So that's by just knowing what role do I grant, because they had no way to know before. So, so Veza can absolutely, and almost always does, we actually make RBAC better, right? It's not that we replace RBAC. And this is also one of the themes about how we work in general, is that we really, I think, have done a nice job of meeting customers where they are. We don't force you to go take a different architecture. We're leveraging all the existing authorization schemes, the native systems that you're already using, but we actually tell you what it means and help you fix what's broken.
Okay, Rich, so help me out here. Does Veza tell me what a person has, or on the other end of the spectrum, who can do some action on my data? Which one?
You can go both directions, right? So this is the beauty of having a graph, is you can start from, for us, the person is on the left side of the graph. And by person, I mean, might be a real person or it might be a service account. But then I can traverse through and say, all right, this person is linked to a group. And that group might be a nested group that then connects to a role. That role might be hierarchical. Then that goes into, maybe I'm going to go through a bunch of different policies in IAM, but then eventually I'm going to get all the way down to a resource in that target system and an action that can be taken on that target system. And so one of the big innovations as well that we've also built in here is this idea of effective permissions, and that we do a translation. And so we don't just give you the raw permissions that are in those systems, because oftentimes it's very hard to understand what those things mean, but we'll actually say, hey, does this mean you can create, read, update, or delete? The language of CRUD, right? And so you can do that on this object. And of course, then you can go the other way as well. And that's one of the beautiful things about the graph. You can say, hey, my customer database, a resource in this system in Snowflake or, Bitbucket. I have a repo in GitHub. I want to see everybody who has access to that thing, right? You can go the other way. And so it's a very flexible kind of data model.
Yeah, I think that's important. It's like you can go either way. And then one of the nuances I picked up on what you're just saying, you can start in the middle.
That's
you
right.
Start with, hey, I want to see what this role or this group does or can do. And I think that's important. There's this debate in the identity community around least privilege, or if you just like take a beeline to zero standing privilege. But the thing is, like, even if you go the zero standing privilege route, eventually you have to put it on to a user. And if you don't really know what it does, then you're just like saying, all right, well, we're going to trust you with this machine gun for 15 minutes and hopefully you use it as intended.
That's exactly right. No, that's great insight, because that's always one of the things that makes me scratch my head is like, zero standing privilege and doing just in time is great. I mean, that's an important aspect, but you're still granting access. And if you're sort of going to, all just in time privilege, like, the number of approvals that have to go through magnifies, by whatever that is, by whatever factor you want to pick. And then those approvals just get rubber stamped. Right. And so you always have, there's always a sort of a balance there, because the more approvals you do and force through a sort of a just in time provisioning system, the less attention that gets paid to each of them. And so you always want to be judicious about that and say, hey, maybe there's some people who should never get access. I don't care who approves it. I don't care if their manager says it's okay. Like, Fred should not be able to blow away the customer database. Like, I don't care if somebody says it's okay.
But it's Fred. Come on. I mean,
I'm sure there's someone out there whose name is Fred who's really, his ears are steaming right now. But
he's not happy with what we're saying about him.
No, I know. I feel
hashtag
sorry.
just Fred things.
I'm sorry, Fred, when you're out there.
There was a video that was saw around intelligent access. And one of the things that it covered, or one of the things I emphasized, was covering all systems. So, all right, I've got my skeptic hat on now, because I've been through enough of these appointments where there's always an asterisk or something. Is it really all systems, meaning legacy systems as well, modern systems, SaaS, non-SaaS? Help me understand what the coverage looks like here and what's realistic from from that coverage or integration perspective.
Yep. That's a great question, and you're right to be skeptical, because that is always the devil's in the details. And the reality is, for some systems that we cover natively, that are cloud, that have well-formed APIs, the integration can be very, very fast, right? And so, on that example, I know of at least one customer where they were able to fully deploy Veza in about 30 minutes, because they were all cloud. And the CISO, who happened to be our sort of customer champion there, happened to have admin level privileges for all the systems that we were worried about. So I won't comment on that, but that was the reality, as it sometimes is. And so he was able to go set up the read-only roles. That's sort of one of the necessary pieces. You want to make sure that Veza has least privilege, that we only have access to the stuff that we need to do the job and fulfill the use cases that you've bought the product for. So it was very straightforward, and then we're off to the races. In other cases, where, for instance, a custom application, or if it's an on-premise application that doesn't have good RESTful APIs, right? Then we've got to figure out a different way to get the data into the Veza system, and that can take some more work. And so an example here is one of our larger customers that's using us for access reviews, integrated in about the first 4 months or so, about 60 different custom applications to do access reviews on, right? And so that took some work, but still, I would say, if you've ever gone through an IGA deployment and tried to do it, getting 60 custom applications in 4 months is a pretty good clip of things. And so that's sort of the longer end. And the other thing I'll say is that from even on-premise systems, we have a couple of customers that are all on-prem, right? Zero cloud. And so they actually, that was actually one that was surprising to me, because I remember asking this. We were at one of our company meetings, and I asked the questions like, "Hey, how are we doing on the on-prem? Is that real?" Because I was wondering myself about how it actually worked in reality, and they were like, "Yeah, we got a couple customers that are fully on-prem," and I was like, "That's really fantastic," because that gives me the confidence that they can actually get the value out of Veza, even though they don't have any cloud infrastructure at all.
I think that's a really important distinction, and maybe I'm not going to try and take over Veza's marketing, but that is an area that I typically see a lot of struggle with. Is, hey, you know what? On-prem is on-prem. We're not even going to try it, man. We're going to focus on the cloud and SaaS-based applications and things like that, because we know that they are having connectivity, they've got integrations, right? All that stuff's there. But, I guess maybe something to think about to go to market is, hey, what is, we can handle the on-prem stuff too, which I think is such a missing link for a lot of things in this space. So I'm happy to hear it. What I'm not happy to hear about is 30 minutes to install something, get things configured. It's going to put people like me out of a job for integrating IGA. But I think that's another thing too, right? Is how quickly you can get in there. Now, 30 minutes, I think you mentioned, was a CISO who had admin access to things, which, say what you want about CISOs. A lot of them do like to have their hands in the pie.
Right.
What does a normal, I guess, integration timeline look like? Is it days, weeks, months? I mean, it can't really be 30 minutes all the time, but what's an average deployment look like?
Yeah, I'd say, on average, it's going to be in the term of weeks. And that's also because, usually what happens is, and we certainly encourage this, is the key to success is to start small. So start with your cloud, start with something easy, and get some wins, right? That's always the thing, to actually build momentum, to build knowledge with the system and understanding with the system. So it sort of it depends where you draw your boundaries and where you draw your lines. But usually customers will start with something in the cloud, get it going quickly, get some wins, and then they're off to the races. So from a deployment in a week or two, that's not unreasonable because that's your approach. But if your goalpost is got 1,000 on-prem applications that are fully customized and on mainframes and AS400s, that will take longer.
Oh, AS400s, green screens. They're giving me flashbacks of our prior life.
Yeah.
The other thing that I thought was interesting was this idea of covering all identities. So I'm guessing that means human and non-human, machine, service accounts, et cetera. I guess how do you make sure that you've got all the identities, types, I guess, covered, and making sure you've got the right correlations in place to say, oh yeah, this is Jeff and not AI version of Jeff or some machine or service account that Jeff is using to run an application. Can you walk us through a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, and I think it's really that I think the thing I'd like to really emphasize here is that the thing that I've seen that is pretty different is also just the way that service accounts have been treated, right? And that obviously there are solutions out there that will go after service accounts, but typically the world of identity hasn't really treated those as sort of full partners, if you will. Where typically the service account types of processes have been around in the PAM world, right? It's been in you want to get your secrets and your certificates into the secrets vault. Yep, that's great. But in terms of doing things like governance around service accounts, or hey, I want to do an access review, not around people, but around hey, do we know what applications the service account is actually attaching to, and is it right? And has the person who developed the service account and created the service account, do they still work at the company? And who owns the service account? Those are the kinds of questions that we typically see are missing. And that's actually one of the things that I think has been most attractive with some of our really large customers, especially in the financial services side. That's sort of where they're headed now, where there's it's actually around this sort of machine identity service account governance processes. That's sort of the forefront of that, where they're saying, yep, we want to do the same kinds of things we do with human-based, HR system-based access reviews, but we want to do it on service accounts. And so I think that's the biggest missing piece. I say it's not necessarily the technology, which is great, and I think the technology is an important piece of that. But the fact that now that most customers have sort of treated it operationally and from a process standpoint as something outside, as something not identity based, and I think that's something that we see changing, which is great.
Rich, I have to key off that because it feels like securing machine accounts, non-human accounts is kind of like the bane of all of our existence these days. They're starting to outnumber human accounts, if not already. Do you find that your customers are coming to you to solve that problem? Like that's the problem they need to solve? Are they starting there?
Many are. Yep. And this is something we were, and like I mentioned, there's, it's a pretty broad set of use cases that people key off, but definitely that service account coverage is a big deal for a number of customers. And I think, this is one of the things I know. And if you mentioned the Microsoft breach, that's certainly one that comes to mind here as we start to see attacks that are sort of well documented and well publicized that focus around, as the Microsoft one did, a legacy OAuth application that had the ability to go get elevated privilege, and that was sort of that OAuth app, and that service account linkage was key to the attack vector, right? That was really the key part of that. And so, as we see more of those things, I think customers are going to start to realize how critical that piece is, and say, yeah, we got to get our security tooling that covers those things as well. We can't just worry about people as we've traditionally defined it. Now we really do have to get to that, because it's not only is it, as you point out, Jim, it's a huge and more rapidly increasing surface area in terms of the number of accounts, the number of machines there, but also the fact that most security tooling, I think, hasn't emphasized that in the same way, especially on the identity side.
So I just want to key off of something else you just said there. So you talked about that Microsoft breach. So you wrote a blog. I read the whole blog, then I watched a video, and then I realized that the whole blog was basically the video. So either read the blog if you'd like to read, or watch the video if you're like me and you don't like to read. I just wanted to point out something. So it was you and Tarun were talking, and you guys went out of your way to compliment Microsoft, right? Because I think that one of the things that they did that really needed to be recognized was that they came out, they were honest about the issue, they documented the issue. It wasn't the best look, right? Because I think it was essentially something that didn't have MFA enabled, right? But rather than try and sweep it under the rug and wait till somebody finds out and try to ignore the issue, they were proactive.
Absolutely. I still give them props, because it's like those things are so valuable certainly for me, but I think it's true for the entire community to really understand what went on. And, and this is the same deal, and maybe, I don't know if I'd give Okta quite as many props in terms of their transparency over the last stuff, but, the information has gotten out there, and it's eventually gotten there around the role that Inbound Federation played in the MGM breach. But again, that when I compare sort of the outward response for Microsoft and Okta, that's why I sort of do give Microsoft props, because they were very forthcoming and had a lot of really good detail. It was like, wow, this is, I really understand how this thing worked. Maybe not fully, but 80% of the way there, I got, it was very useful and actionable in terms of sort of how that all went down.
I always find it a struggle and a challenge to figure out, when do you make disclosures like that? Because I think there's a rush to, do you tell people right away and not know the full story? Or do you wait till you have the full story and then tell people? And there's always, I don't envy anybody who has to disclose information like that, because I think you're really caught in a rock and a hard place. You're already, in trouble because you had an incident. And now it's, well, what if we release information too early and it's not correct? Right? Is it better to release early and then have to make corrections, or do you wait until you know a little bit more? What's the right balance? The longer you wait, people get suspicious and they're like, well, why didn't you tell us sooner? It's a difficult balance, and I don't envy any organization that gets put in that position. That's for sure.
Yeah, my gosh, I look at the CISOs that are at our customer organizations, like that is a tough job, and it's no joke. So I agree, that's really, really challenging. And it's also interesting because, although it's not sort of what I'd say like our primary use case, but it's one that I think is going to be a really interesting one for us, for Veza, actually in the future, is actually starting to bring to bear this whole question of, who has access to what, but do it in the context of post-breach investigations. In the security operations team, because this is one of the things that I've definitely heard is, obviously the gold standard is, I want to look at the activity. I want to look, okay, I had a breached account. I'm going to go check and look at the logs and see, what did this account access, after this time and date. But the challenge that I've heard from CISOs is really that, hey, logging is great, but a lot of times logging isn't turned on, right? Because it's expensive and it's a lot of memory, and people charge you, left, right, and center for it. And so sometimes it just never gets turned on. And sometimes when it's turned on, it doesn't quite give you the right information, right? It's not enough to really understand what went on. And so you end up having some big gaps. And so you can never just rely on logging. After an incident, like, you've got to keep going. You've got to dig deeper. And so, if you think about sort of a set of concentric circles, the first one you go do is like look at the logging and look at the activity. But then the next, you want to say, well, what could this account have touched? Like, what were the permissions for that account? And that's one where Veza is extremely powerful. And I'll throw in one other product pitch and then I'll stop. But we also do leverage the activity monitoring as well. So, so now it's actually pulling both of those things into a single platform, not just the activity of who accessed what, but also who could access what. And having those two things together, I think, is going to be a really powerful use case for post-breach forensic security operations in the future.
Well, you must be reading my mind, because I was kind of thinking here as you're talking, is like a tool like this would be really handy for a forensic investigation. I guess it's better to have it before the incident happens, so you can capture the activity of what's happening. But even afterwards, being able to do that diagnosis of, okay, well, here's the account. Now at least we know the account that got popped, or whatever phrase you want to use, right? That caused the breach. What else could it have touched? I think is really interesting. So you kind of stole my thunder there. So pitch away. That was where I was headed anyway, from a question standpoint.
Nice. We're on the same page here. That's good.
We are. So I want to wrap up the conversation with a lighter note, because that's how we typically will end our shows. The last time you were here, we asked questions around longevity, because that was something that I think you've got some interest in. We talked about what's the most interesting thing you've learned about longevity. If you want to know more about that, again, go back to episode 231. But I want to stay in that same vein, right? Try to stay with interests. This one I think is a little more fun, maybe thought-provoking. And Rich, I'll ask you first. The fountain of youth or the wisdom of age? If you could only choose one, which would you pick and why?
It is a fantastic question. And I think, it depends on, how old I am when you ask this question. Because I think one of the beautiful things about getting older has been appreciating the wisdom of age more. And, I also think about, as I've gotten older, there's a level of comfort and confidence, and just, knowing who you are is just a wonderful thing. And, I think about it because I've got two teenage boys, and just, the challenges of being a teenager and thinking that everybody is staring at you is so mentally traumatizing. It's tough. Being a teenager was really rough. And, as you get older, you just start to care less and less. And, and this is why you see so many old guys walking around with plaid pants, is they just stopped caring. And there's a beauty to that I've really appreciated. So I don't have my plaid pants yet, but I aspire to that.
So plaid pants is how we know that you've picked the wisdom of age.
That's right. That's when I'm on I've reached the final stage of development.
Jim, how about yourself? Which one do you pick? Fountain of youth or wisdom of age?
Man, I don't think anybody could have said it better than Rich right there. I mean, seriously, like, every thought I was having on this topic, he just hit all of them. And I actually feel like I'm happier now at 50 than I was at 40. And I remember having the thought, I'm happier now at 40 than I was at 30. And I'll bet you it goes all the way back. And I have two teenage boys as well. I've got a 19-year-old who I love him to death, right? It's like he's working a job like manual labor and making like under $20 an hour. And he's talking about going and buying like a $40,000 truck. And it's like, as a 50-year-old, you just look at that and you're just like, my goodness, kid, what are you thinking about? You have zero debt right now. And it's like he can't wait to get into debt. And what he doesn't realize is once you get into debt, you're in debt for the rest of your life. Because you're always running credit cards and you get ahead financially and all that, right? It's not like you're living paycheck to paycheck your whole life, but you've always got payments, right? Most of us all have a mortgage and maybe a car payment, etc. What would be ideal? I know this is cheating with this question, would be youth, physical youth, but also keeping your wisdom. I And I know that's
No,
cheating.
Jim,
What
come
about
on.
you, Jeff?
I mean, that's absolutely 100%
right.
cheating. I mean, that's what everyone wants, right? I mean, there's TV shows that, vampires live forever. You got Altered Carbon, which if you've never seen on Netflix is fantastic. I love it. Same idea there.
I've heard that Warren Buffett said that he would give up all of his money to be like 21 again. So I'm not going to go
But
with
does
that.
he retain the knowledge that he's gained?
Because I think 45 to anyway. I'm only 50, so I can't speak beyond this too much with experience anyway. But I think in that range, I'm happy with where I'm at. Like, I don't like all the signs of aging, but I'm really like happy with my life. I'm happy with the person that I am. If people don't like me, I really don't care. And I can't say that when I was in my 20s. Like, I really cared what people thought of me. What about you, Jeff?
Rich, I couldn't disagree more. I wish I was still 20 and could almost dunk a basketball. Yes, I used to be able to. If you look at me now, it's like, there's no way that dude is getting any more than 6 inches off the ground. No, I'm just kidding. I think you hit it right on the head. I mean, everything you just said, same thing. More confident, more comfortable of who I am, the knowledge that I've gained. Now if I could pause time, I think that would be great. I think Jim, you hit it as well too. Like, I'm happier now than I was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, etc. And I had some great times. Look, I feel like I've led a great life. I've had a lot of experiences, a lot of fun stuff that I've done. Very fortunate in that regard. But yeah, I don't think I would trade youth for the wisdom that's been accumulated over the years. So I feel like we're all, I don't know, maybe this is an old hat question. If you ask a younger person if they would answer it the same way, but it feels like we're all on the same page, except I'm not going to wear the plaid pants. I would still feel too self-conscious about that. I felt like a real nerd wearing my Apple Vision Pro on a flight last week. And I did return it, by the way. That experiment is over, but I have not felt that self-conscious in a very long time. Putting that thing on, I'm like, I know I'm going to return this, but I got to try it out, see what's like. And yeah, you totally hit that question on the head for me as well.
Awesome. Well, just as we leave with parting thoughts, I think, Jim, if you convinced your 19-year-old son, really the beauty and all the benefits of a 15-year-old minivan, I can hook you up here. I've got something for you.
The kid's got a Mustang. I handed him down my old
might be a bit of a stretch to go minivan.
Mustang, and not good enough. He's in truck
I've seen your Mustang. It's a nice car too. I mean, I'll tell you what, I had the cheapest Chevrolet car that you could possibly have. It only had 3 cylinders in it for an engine, and I was thrilled to have it. So,
what car was that?
A Mustang is good. Well, I'm not going to tell you because that's a secret question, man. But you'll have to guess it.
Awesome, I love it.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not going to be that hard to guess, and I think I've changed all those answers anyway. But if you Google 3-cylinder, it would have been, I guess, mid to late 90s.
Was it a Yugo?
Really
Did you have a Yugo?
No, it was a Chevy.
Oh, okay.
It was a Chevrolet brand. Let's put it that way. So there's the trivia for folks.
Did you have to crank it up before you drove
it? Look, I've heard you can't make fun of me because I've heard every single joke. Nothing that you're going to say I've not heard before about that car. But you know what? It was my car. It gave me freedom. I could get wherever I wanted.
Jeff, this car these are your plaid pants right here.
That was my plaid pants. I'm glad I outgrew it. Now I'm very happy in my electric vehicle, and yeah, life moves on. Let's go ahead and leave it there. That was a whole lot of fun, Rich. Thank you so much for coming back with us and having that conversation. I hope folks will go out and check out Veza.com, Veza, and really check out what you guys are doing. I think you guys are doing some really remarkable stuff, and I think there's a lot of applications that, at first glance, maybe it was like, oh, okay, it's this. It was like, oh, wait, there's so much more. We'll have links in our show notes for people to check out, want to connect with you, Rich, ask you questions, argue with you politely about Fountain of Youth versus, wisdom and age and things like that. We'll also have links to Veza's website as well, so you can check them out. And yeah, we'll go ahead and leave it there for this week. Thank you again so much, Rich, for taking the time with us. Jim, as always, thanks for your time. And thanks for everyone for listening. You can find us on the web, idacpodcast.com, or on Twitter or X or whatever it's called by the time you listen to this, at IDAC Podcast. And we'll leave it there. Thanks, everyone. And we'll talk with everyone in the next one.
Thanks much.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com and find us on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. See you next time on Identity at the Center.